My favourite recent trend in gaming has to be the one accidentally started by Capcom in 2019 when they released the Resident Evil 2 remake. Instead of throwing any old zombie game together and slapping the Resi name on top of it, they followed the previous formula they found with the first Resident Evil remake over a decade before. Basically, they kept the remake incredibly faithful to the original while primarily focusing on updating it with modern game design. Other companies seeing the money bags eventually followed suit, which gave us the Dead Space remake and the much anticipated Metal Gear Solid 3 and Silent Hill 2 remakes. But it's not any of those that I want to talk about, because while I have either high hopes or high praise for them all, I don't think they really have much of an uphill battle. The Dead Space remake is great, but it's really just a shiny copy of the original. And while the Resi 2, 3 and 4 remakes all do a lot to add fresh content into those classics, their main aim was to modernize those games with dynamic perspectives and a more palatable control scheme. At their core, they're still the same games. Alone in the Dark, on the other hand, started life looking like this. So it doesn't take long to see that the Alone remake is a far cry from the original in terms of visual design. Most notably, the fact that despite the original being called Alone in the Dark, every room in the remake isn't brighter than having a flashbang shoved into your fucking eye socket. In the run-up to Alone's release, I'm pretty sure I wasn't alone in thinking it looked pretty meh. Even though it was set to be written and directed by the same talent that brought us Soma, it was coming from an untested development team that only have mobile games and Titan Quest DLC on their CV. Throw in a boring and scaleless demo, plus the game clearly not having a large budget, and what it did have mostly going to new Hollywood talent David Harbour and Jodie Comer, and I think I was justified in keeping my expectations lower than dirt. So would you believe my surprise when I actually kind of really enjoyed it? There's quite a lot of issues, and throughout the video, it's probably going to sound like I hate the game, so let me quickly get all the negatives out the way first, and then I'll try to explain why none of it matters to me. I've already mentioned that David Harbour and Emily Comer's inclusion here seem mainly to drum up some kind of interest in a franchise that hasn't been relevant since the 90s, and the reason I feel that way is because it's hard to find a reason these actors were needed for these specific roles. They both give solid, if uneventful, performances, but these are both genuine Hollywood talents, which the writers never seemed to realise. There's no opportunity for either of them to do anything challenging. Some of the humour lands in the nonchalant, I'm not sure if I was even supposed to find that funny kind of way. Beyond that though, there's no reason they couldn't have spent half the money and just gotten Troy Baker to do it. I get the advertisement perspective, but did anyone really buy Alone in the Dark because the Stranger Things guy was in it? I'm not even being facetious, I genuinely would like to know if anyone did. The argument could be made that they're purposefully giving subdued performances. As a matter of fact, everything about the game is overly understated. It doesn't draw you into its world with carefully crafted lighting or detailed sound design like Resi or the Dead Space remake, and the characters don't have a great deal to say about the life-altering horrors happening to them. I'm not sure if that's a Silent Hill-esque creative choice or just a restriction of the budget, but the fact I'm questioning it means that either way, it hasn't done the game any favors. The best way I can describe it is that it's that metaphorical zone of horror where all the characters don't really speak like real people actually speak. The desired effect is to make the player feel uneasy. If none of the characters seem rational, none of them feel safe. And that is supposed to cast a very disconcerting shadow over the whole experience. For me though, all it does is make it hard to give two shits about any of these fucking weirdos. Take for example, the only justification the game seems willing to give for Edward Carnby's continued inclusion in the story is that he's being paid to be there.
Trust me, you're getting your money's worth. At this rate, I'm an absolute bargain.
I respect commitment to the craft, but maybe just fucking take off, dude. Like, I think Emily is probably too preoccupied to write you a bad review in Detective Weekly. If all this is a choice, it's a clumsy one that a lot of horrors aiming for metaphorical fear often end up tripping over. The odd presentation isn't limited to just the story. Any survival horror fan will be able to tell you the importance of the first enemy encounter. It's a pivotal moment for any game stepping into the genre. Not only does it establish the danger for our main character's journey, it also sets the tone for the rest of the player's journey as well. Look at the original Resident Evil. Our first experience with a zombie is built up by the iconic visual of the zombie slowly turning to reveal its face, only for the game to drop us straight out of the cutscene and make us fend for ourselves. Or let's take Dead Space, which locks you away from your NPC team and forces you to helplessly observe how violent the necromorphs can be as they tear apart your colleagues. Then, like in Resi, you're suddenly thrust into the first gameplay encounter with the monsters, except in this case, there's no way to defend yourself. All you can do is run. Both instances tell us the next several hours of our lives are going to be filled with desperate, hard-fought battles against forces we're barely equipped to handle. This is Alone in the Dark's version of that. Like the two examples, the first enemy reveal is sudden, but not really in a good way.
What are you doing?
Nothing. Me? Just hanging around.
Our main characters barely have a reaction to finding out that monsters literally exist, which again makes it very weird they'd be hiring known talent and not let them explore the emotions a character would feel if this happened. It feels like the devs forgot to make a monster intro sequence, so they just threw this in. The twist of being attacked by an unseen enemy instead of the one the camera focuses on is nice, but in 2024, it's way too predictable, which is something a reimagining of Alone in the Dark was always going to struggle with. Some context for those that might not know a lot about the franchise: the original game is considered to be the grandfather of survival horror. All the games I've mentioned previously, along with a shit ton of other beloved additions to the genre, wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the 1992 classic. And while the game deserves, and gets, full respect from me for what it achieved, especially at such an early stage in gaming's timeline, I don't think it's unfair to say that it's kinda shit now. The standard of video games have skyrocketed over the last 30 years, something that many remakes, and not just horror remakes, have had to overcome. So when putting together a modern version of a hugely important piece of media, how do you decide what to keep and what to cut? If you change the basic premise, you may as well have just called it something else. Tone also needs to remain intact, but the expectations of horror have changed so much across all mediums that you run the risk of crafting something inherently outdated. We see this most in the story. It's bare bones at best and trundles along until a very uninspired ending. But it's only uninspired because it's recreating a classic that's been copied and adapted countless times since. It's the same reason I don't have much love for Halloween or Austin Powers. I can understand and appreciate the impact they had, but by the time I'd gotten to them, they'd been parodied, homaged, and inspired God knows how many other projects, so they never seemed very original, despite being the originals. Also, I just don't like people called Mike Myers, I guess.
Oh, behave!
All of this is a big shame to me, because I feel like if any classic horror game could get away with making fundamental changes, it's Alone in the Dark. Resident Evil 4 is still so beloved by its fans that any major deviation from the source material would have pissed off a lot of people, so they had to be careful and focus on adapting instead of changing. And of course, some people were still pissed off anyway, but I don't remember the last time someone told me they cared about Alone in the Dark. After decades of poorly received sequels and an already failed attempt at restarting the series, surely no one would have minded if some crazier creative liberties were taken. I actually have a video on that first Alone in the Dark remake. It's very old now, but I still think it's a fun enough watch, and I'll link it in the description maybe. It feels like the easy approach was taken in regards to updating the dated classic. Straight away, the game proves this by asking the player to select a character. Regardless of who you choose though, next to nothing about the game changes. We're going to get into some late game spoilers, so if you want to avoid that, feel free to stick your fingers in your eyes and ears while saying blah 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 until the timestamp on screen. Basically, the only actual difference between the two characters are a few tweaks to cutscenes that don't make a second playthrough really worth the effort, especially when the gameplay is so repetitive. The entire time, it's split into two sections: roaming the Decanto Manor, completing basic puzzles, and fantastical, otherworldly combat-focused areas. Exploring the house, discovering secrets is my preferred of the two, although unlike Resident Evil, where learning the layout of the map is paramount to saving ammo and not getting your face chewed off, in Alone, it only serves the purpose of minimalizing the constant and endlessly slow door opening animations. Actually, I guess it kinda has that in common with Resident Evil as well. You know how at the start I said I quite like the game? The more I talk about it, the more I realise I can only think of problems. It's a love letter to survival horror's legacy, but expressing love doesn't mean it holds up when being brought into the 21st century. I also do want to give the dev team props for jumping from making Titan Quest DLC to a AAA title of their very own, but £60 is just not the right price for this.
Try some of my dried grapes.
A new Alone in the Dark was always going to have an uphill battle, which kept me rooting for them the whole time. The game has a certain charm that only comes from a genuine, passionate attempt to make something the creators would have happily played themselves. The combat is simplistic, but fun enough, and the puzzles are just clever enough to make me feel like a big brain boy whenever I crack a solution. At a lower price, I'd happily recommend this as an enjoyable throwback experience for someone looking for a more laid-back survival horror. As it stands, I respect Alone in the Dark 2024. I'm not entirely sure it's good though. I'd love to hear what you have to say about it, because it's a very polarizing game for me, and I can't tell if the reviews are good or bad or in the middle, and I just want to get a gist of how people even feel about it. And if you also enjoyed the video, we'd appreciate if you left a like or even considered subscribing to the channel for more like this. We also have a Patreon for anyone willing and able to financially support the creation of new content, although times be tough, so we get it, we don't expect it. We're honestly just glad you got to this part in the video. Thank you for watching, and cheers.